There is a silent force that often goes unnoticed, especially in a world that constantly pushes us to react, to explain, to defend ourselves, to show others that we weren't as affected as it seems. But there is something profoundly wise in not doing so, in not chasing after someone who leaves, in not trying to convince someone who has already decided not to stay, because what seems like passivity is often courage, and what seems like resignation can be a deeply mature decision. The choice not to lower yourself to the level of someone who replaced you as if you were interchangeable. That moment when you choose silence, not as punishment, but as respect for yourself, marks a turning point. It's the instant when you stop acting out of impulse, pain, or the need for approval and slowly begin to act from your center. Not responding is no longer synonymous with weakness. It is an affirmation of inner strength. When someone ignores you, abandons you, or replaces you without hesitation, the noise left inside you can be deafening. The mind wants to speak, to demand, to set things right. But if you pause, if you choose not to follow that impulse, you discover something valuable. You don't need to prove your worth to keep being worthy. Silence is not the absence of words. It is conscious presence. It is the moment when you listen to yourself above all else. When you stop begging for explanations or apologies, you are sending a clear message. I don't need you to understand me, to know who I am. And that, though it seems simple, is one of the most powerful acts of self-respect. Think about this when you decide not to send that last message, not to check their social media, not to seek through others what that person is doing now. You're not losing. You're reclaiming your energy, letting the echo of your silence fill the space you once occupied with presence, care, and affection. And I assure you, that echo reaches them. They may not acknowledge it out loud. They may never express it. But the void you leave when you walk away in peace is more eloquent than any reproach. Many believe that stopping talking is giving up. But giving up is not staying silent. Giving up is surrendering to resentment. It's staying trapped in the need for the other to see you, understand you, or repair you. Staying silent, when done consciously, is an act of emotional emancipation. It is telling the world and yourself that you are no longer available to keep giving your soul where it is not received. And of course, it hurts. It hurts not to have the last word. It hurts to face the uncertainty of what the other thinks. It hurts to imagine them moving on with their life as if nothing happened. But even so, you choose not to put yourself on sale emotionally because your dignity is worth more than a response. And because you understand that self-love is also built through uncomfortable decisions. So, I invite you to consider this. What would happen if instead of seeking that perfect phrase to set everything right, you simply chose to say nothing more? What would happen if your silence were not an absence, but a resounding declaration of your inner presence? And yes, without the need for words, you could communicate to the world and to yourself that you have decided not to return to a place where you are no longer seen. There is a deeply mistaken idea we were taught early on that we can be replaceable, that if someone leaves us, it's because there's someone better, more suitable, more interesting, more correct to take that place. As if people were pieces on a board, easily interchangeable according to the needs of the moment. But the truth, discovered through pain, but also through freedom, is that no one can take your place. No one can be you. And that's not arrogance. It's emotional reality. When someone tries to replace you, what they're really doing is avoiding facing the void you left. They try to fill a space they don't know how to inhabit alone, and maybe they succeed for a while. Maybe they seem happy, carefree, as if nothing happened. But you are not just a memory. You are a footprint. And even if they deny you, minimize you, or pretend you weren't important, that doesn't erase what you gave or who you were. Think about the way you cared, the details you paid attention to, your way of looking, of being present in silence, of being there without demanding. That way of being cannot be copied, manufactured, or repeated. It is part of your emotional singularity, and whoever received it, even if they didn't value it at the time, carries it with them because you cannot erase what was real. You can only deny it, and denials crack with time. It's important not to confuse the other silence with forgetting. Not everything unspoken has disappeared. Sometimes, those who seem to have moved on are simply fleeing from the discomfort of what they left behind. And that discomfort doesn't speak of you. It speaks of what you meant in a world where the superficial prevails, where the immediate is overvalued, where next is easier than repair. Your depth is an act of resistance. Your ability to feel, to engage emotionally, to bet on something true is not a mistake. It's a privilege that few dare to sustain. Maybe that person couldn't handle your intensity. Maybe they weren't ready. Maybe they didn't know how to see you. But that doesn't diminish your value. On the contrary, when someone doesn't know how to receive what you offer, that doesn't lessen you. It reveals their limitations. That's why it's so important not to get lost in the mirage of comparing yourself to whoever came after. You don't know what that person is living now. You don't know what the other is hiding behind their apparent stability. And you don't need to know either, because your path isn't built on what others do. It's built from the moment you decide not to betray yourself for anyone else. So I invite you to think, can you remember who you are when you're not trying to prove it? Can you inhabit your singularity without needing to be recognized by someone who no longer saw you? Can you honor what you were, even if it wasn't valued? Because your worth doesn't depend on being chosen. It depends on not forgetting yourself in the process. There is a huge difference between being rejected and being redirected. But when we're left, when we feel replaced, the first impulse is to believe we weren't enough, that there was something in us, a lack, a flaw, a fragility that caused their departure. That's the automatic narrative, but it's not the true one. The truth is that not everyone is prepared to receive what you have to give. Not everyone knows what to do with an authentic connection, with deep giving, with a presence that doesn't settle for superficial games. Sometimes what the other calls too much is simply something that exceeds their emotional capacity. And that's not your fault. It's their limitation. You are not too much. You are intense. You are real. And that for many is terrifying. That's why when someone leaves, it's not always because you weren't enough. Sometimes it's because you were too real for someone who only knows bonds made of evasion, masks, or emotional strategies. And yes, that hurts because when someone you gave your best to leaves, it feels like an injustice. But with time, if you stop to look with different eyes, you'll see that you weren't replaced. You were liberated. Liberated from reducing yourself, from molding yourself to fit into spaces where your soul couldn't breathe. Liberated from dimming your light to avoid making others uncomfortable, liberated from sustaining a story that demanded you make yourself small so the other wouldn't feel insecure. That's not love. That's self-denial. And yes, in that moment, you may not see it because the wound is fresh, because your ego screams, because the need for closure drags you toward idealization. But when the fog clears, you realize that abandonment wasn't a loss. It was a sign, an interruption the universe sent you, even through pain, to remind you that you're called to something greater than begging for affection. Being left doesn't mean you should close yourself off to love. It means you need to review where you're loving from. From lack, from fear, from the illusion that if you do everything right, no one will leave you, or from integrity, from the freedom to choose yourself, even when the other doesn't. Because you're not here to convince anyone to stay. You're here to live your life authentically, and that means losing people. It means saying goodbye to places you got used to, but that no longer represent you. It means having the courage to let go of those who let go of you, not out of revenge, but out of coherence. So pause for a moment, breathe, think. What parts of yourself had you diminished to be accepted? How much of yourself had you hidden to avoid making others uncomfortable? And now that you're alone, now that you don't have to pretend, isn't that a form of freedom? One of the most disconcerting wounds comes when we see that the person who left us almost immediately connects with someone else. There's no time for the silence to speak, no space for the grief to breathe, and suddenly an image, a post, a piece of news confronts us with an uncomfortable question. Was everything we lived so fragile? Was it so easy to replace us? In those moments, pain mixes with disbelief, with anger, with a sense of being invisible. But there's something we must understand deeply. When someone quickly jumps into another relationship, they're not building, they're escaping. They're not loving, they're numbing. They're not choosing the other, they're avoiding facing themselves. That quick replacement, that seemingly firm move, is nothing more than a flight disguised as moving on. It's easier to project onto a new person what wasn't confronted in the previous relationship. It's more comfortable to start something from scratch than to repair what was broken inside. But that kind of bond isn't real. It has no roots. It's an emotional distraction that only holds the void at bay for a while. You, on the other hand, are in a different place because you chose not to mask your pain, but to feel it. You chose not to fill your loneliness with empty promises, but to face your own voids, your own shadows, your own wounds. And though that hurts more at first, in the end, it builds you in a way the other won't understand until they inevitably face the mirror of what they didn't resolve. Because while some repeat patterns, you are creating something different. And that takes time. It takes silence. It takes moments of discomfort, sleepless nights, questions without answers. But it also takes truth. And with truth comes transformation. Don't confuse speed with healing. Don't believe that someone who runs into another's arms is more whole than you. Often, those who quickly change partners are the ones least capable of being with themselves. And you're learning to be with yourself, to listen to yourself, to care for yourself, to rebuild yourself with the pieces that remain, not from urgency, but from consciousness. So don't compare yourself. Don't diminish yourself by someone else's pace, because your process isn't measured in days or new conquests. It's measured in integrity, in the depth with which you're willing to inhabit yourself without the need for anesthesia. And that, though it doesn't shine on social media or receive applause, is what truly heals. So I ask you, what do you prefer? An immediate distraction that hides your wound, or a slow but true reconstruction that returns you to yourself? One of the most common and cruelest traps in the process of emotional grief is comparison. Without realizing it, you start observing the new person who now occupies the place that was once yours. You analyze. You wonder, are they better than me? Younger? More attractive? Easier to deal with? What do they have that I didn't? And without noticing, you drift away from yourself. You become a judge of your own story based on a narrative that isn't yours, that you don't even know. Comparing yourself is handing the other the power to define your worth. It's telling yourself that you need to resemble someone else to be enough. And that's not only unfair, it's deeply violent to yourself because it tears you away from your essence, disconnects you from your singularity, makes you believe that your way of loving, of seeing life, of giving yourself was a mistake, but it wasn't. What you gave was authentic, perhaps imperfect, yes, like everything human, but real. You don't need to copy anyone. You don't need to outdo anyone. You're not in competition with the new figure now appearing in the other's life because you're not living the same story, not in the same time, not from the same place. And even if that person seems happy, smiling, aligned with what the other was looking for, that doesn't invalidate what you were. Because what's true doesn't get erased by a new relationship. What's true remains, even if it's not mentioned, even if it's ignored. Comparison comes from fear, not from truth. It comes from the desire to know you're worthy, but seeking that validation outside. And that's the problem. Because the only comparison that makes sense is with yourself. Who were you before that relationship? And who are you becoming now? What are you learning, facing, transforming? It's not about proving to the other that you're better than whoever came after. It's about proving to yourself that you can choose yourself even when you weren't chosen, that you can hold your gaze without lowering your head, that you can keep walking without looking sideways to check if you're winning. Sometimes the real victory isn't winning the other back. It's not losing yourself in the process. It's not diluting your worth in a competition that makes no sense, that has no clear rules, that has no end. Because what you offered with your story, with your ways, even with your wounds, is unrepeatable, and that carries weight, one that time will inevitably reveal. So, what would happen if you stopped looking outward, if you stopped asking what the other has that you don't, and instead started remembering everything you do have that no one else can replicate? One of the biggest mistakes we make when someone rejects or leaves us is believing that their action defines our worth, that because we weren't chosen, we don't matter, that because we weren't recognized, we don't exist. And that idea, though it sounds absurd when said out loud, carries a silent weight within us. It lodges in the body, in self-esteem, in the thoughts that accompany us at night. If they didn't love me, maybe I have nothing to offer, but there's a truth that needs to be said clearly, even if it's hard to accept at first. Not everyone who rejects you does so because they see something wrong in you. Sometimes they reject you because they lack the capacity to see deeply, because they're so disconnected from their own worth that they can't recognize the worth of others, because they don't know how to inhabit relationships that demand honesty, commitment, real presence, And faced with that, they often choose to walk away, not because you're not worthy, but because they don't know how to hold what you are. Imagine this. You offer gold, but you give it to someone who's never seen gold in their life, who doesn't know how to distinguish it from dust. Who has the problem? The gold, or the one who can't recognize its value? You can't spend your life waiting for others to confirm what you haven't yet allowed yourself to believe. That you are enough, that your story matters, that your way of feeling, though intense, is not a flaw. It's a gift. But it only becomes a gift when you start treating it as such, because the most important recognition doesn't come from outside, from the words you expect, from the apologies that never came, from the gestures you dreamed of that never happened. It comes from you, from looking at yourself without judgment, from remembering your giving without reproach, from validating what you offered, even if it wasn't received as you hoped. The real work begins there, when you no longer depend on the other to feel valid, when you stop begging for love or attention, when you understand that your dignity is not for sale, that your energy is not currency, that your emotions are not negotiable. And that doesn't mean closing yourself off, becoming cold or distrustful. It means maturing emotionally, understanding that loving doesn't have to mean losing yourself, that giving doesn't have to mean sidelining yourself, that caring is not the same as abandoning yourself for another. So breathe. Ask yourself this question honestly. How many times have you conditioned your worth to the reflection the other gave you? And what would happen if, for the first time, you looked at yourself without external mirrors, without comparisons, without needs? Could you hold your own gaze with tenderness and say, I too deserve to recognize myself? There's a silent waiting that settles in after the end of a relationship. It's not always visible. Sometimes we don't even recognize it as waiting, but it's there, waiting for a message, a final conversation, an apology, an explanation that helps us understand why what happened, happened. We wait as if that closure, that final piece, could make sense of the pain, as if without that closure, we couldn't turn the page. But there's something profoundly liberating in understanding that not every chapter needs a final period written by the other, that not all bonds close with words, that not all stories are explained. Sometimes they just end, and we resist that idea because ambiguity hurts, because we want emotional order, because we desire something that says, this happened for this reason. But life rarely works that way. The absence of answers is also an answer. The other's silence, as harsh as it may be, also communicates. It says something about their level of awareness, their emotional responsibility, their capacity or incapacity to hold a difficult conversation. And that doesn't define you. It's not your reflection. It's theirs. Seeking closure outside when the other is no longer available to give it is like trying to lock a door with a key that no longer exists. It only wears you down, keeps you spinning in circles, keeps you tied to a weight that has no end. Because deep down, what hurts most isn't the lack of explanation, but the illusion that if you had it, everything would fall into place. But not everything falls into place. Sometimes it just hurts, and that's where your true healing process begins. When you choose to stop chasing answers that won't come and instead ask yourself what you need to move forward, what part of you still can't let go, what wound is triggered every time you see the other moving on as if you were never there. Closing isn't forgetting. It's not denying. It's not pretending nothing happened. It's looking at what was, acknowledging what hurt, being grateful for what it taught you, even if that gratitude comes much later, and deciding not to keep waiting outside for what can only be resolved within. And that takes courage. Courage to say, I don't need the other to confirm what I already know. Courage to accept that the other isn't coming, isn't going to repair, isn't going to explain, and that even so, you can move forward. With a wound, yes, but also with a new strength. So, ask yourself this question honestly and without haste. What are you waiting for the other to say that you haven't yet said to yourself? There's something profoundly powerful in your absence, something we often underestimate, especially when we come from relationships where we got used to justifying our presence, proving our worth, explaining ourselves over and over in the hope of being understood. But when you finally choose to leave without noise, without scenes, without speeches, something changes, not outside, but within you. Because it's not about disappearing as a form of punishment. It's not about manipulating the other with your distance. It's about protecting the most sacred thing you have, your emotional dignity. Choosing not to return where you weren't seen clearly is an act of self-love. It's saying to yourself, I'm not going to fight for a place that should have been mine without struggle. And that hurts. It hurts to leave when a part of you still wants to stay. It hurts to accept that there's no reciprocity, that what you offered wasn't recognized, that what you expected won't come. But even so, you leave because there's something more important than external validation, your peace. And that's where your absence begins to speak, where the space you leave starts to be felt, because you weren't just company, you were presence, care, depth. And when that disappears, no matter how much they deny it, no matter how much they hide it, it leaves a void, one that isn't easily filled. Your silence isn't indifference. It's a declaration. I'm no longer going to negotiate myself. And that's one of the most powerful things you can say without opening your mouth. Because when someone chooses to leave your life and you don't run after them, don't beg, don't plead, you're communicating something much stronger than any speech, that you choose yourself, that you respect yourself, that you've learned to value yourself in your solitude. And yes, maybe the other doesn't understand it, maybe they never acknowledge it, but it doesn't matter, because you're not doing it to spark regret in anyone. You're doing it to repair the most important relationship you have, the one with yourself. Being at peace with yourself is worth more than any external reconciliation, worth more than any pending closure, worth more than any attempt to recover something that deep down no longer represents you. So, I invite you to think, what does your absence say when you stop seeking explanations, revenge, or demonstrations? What does it say when you simply choose the path that brings you back to yourself? There's something many people discover late. Not everything that shines at first withstands time. What seems fascinating on the surface often lacks roots. And when someone leaves you for something or someone more attractive, more available, more easy, it's natural that your first reaction is to feel less, as if you lost to a more convincing version of what you are. But that's just an illusion, because someone who chooses the superficial isn't finding something better. They're seeking something more comfortable. And what's comfortable isn't always true. What's comfortable doesn't challenge, doesn't confront, doesn't demand growth. What's comfortable entertains, distracts, calms fear for a while. But with time, depth starts to be missed. The soul begins to notice the difference between what dazzles and what nourishes. You know how to love intensely. You give from the details, from presence, from consciousness. And that, though not everyone values it in the moment, doesn't go unnoticed. Because when someone gets used to your light, a light that doesn't impose but accompanies, they find it very hard to live in the shadow of imitations. And it's not about waiting for the other to regret it. It's not about sitting back to see time prove you right. It's about understanding that your worth doesn't diminish because someone chose another direction. That someone who chooses shine over substance ends up with empty hands. And that you, even in your silence, keep building something the other doesn't even know how to name. Authenticity isn't always attractive at first because it demands commitment, depth, courage, and not everyone is ready for that. But when everything else fails, when the novelty wears off, when the mirror stops reflecting what they wanted to see, what remains is what was real. And that's what you offered. Your role isn't to be an alternative. You're not a temporary refuge. You're not the almost, the pretty good. You are a complete universe with emotions, with history, with a way of seeing that can't be taught. And if someone couldn't hold that, the loss wasn't yours. So let the other follow their path. Let them discover in time what they really lost. And meanwhile, you keep sowing authenticity, even amidst the pain, because in that soil is where a new way of loving yourself grows, one that doesn't need approval or substitutes. And now I ask you, will you keep doubting your light because someone chose the reflection? There comes a moment after the pain, after the confusion, after the silence, when something changes. It's not a drastic or dramatic change. It doesn't come with fireworks. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. You start to see yourself with different eyes, no longer from lack, nor from the urgency to be chosen, nor from the effort to prove to the world that you're valuable. You look from a calmer, more honest, more your place. And there, without realizing it, true self-love begins to be born. Because you're no longer available to beg for attention, no longer available to accept crumbs, no longer willing to shrink yourself in bonds where you have to make yourself small for the other to stay. You no longer need to justify what you feel or hide your intensity. You're no longer willing to negotiate your dignity just to avoid feeling alone. That change, though silent, is an internal revolution because it means moving from seeking love outside to cultivating it within. It means accepting that no one is coming to save you, and that's not a tragedy. It's a liberation, because now you know you can be your own refuge, your own safe space, your own starting point. And no, that doesn't mean becoming cold, closed off, or self-sufficient to an extreme. It means you choose yourself, you recognize yourself, you know your worth, not from arrogance, but from intimacy with your story. You know what you gave, you know what you learned, you know what you're not willing to repeat. Now you walk differently, maybe slower, maybe with scars, but also with a clearer gaze. You no longer idealize. You no longer throw yourself into the void expecting someone to catch you. You no longer need someone else to complete you because you're learning to inhabit yourself, to hold yourself, to give yourself what you once begged for. And that's the true closure, not the one that comes from outside, not the one that depends on explanations or perfect endings. The true closure is when you realize you don't need to change anything about yourself to be worthy of love, that the only thing you need is to never abandon yourself for anyone again. So now, with everything you've lived, with everything you've felt, with everything you've let go of, ask yourself, are you ready to start loving yourself for real? To build a life where your peace is the priority, to stop chasing and start choosing. Because the deepest love isn't the one you receive. It's the one you decide to give yourself every day, even in silence, even with fear, even without certainties,